The ideas expressed in the following presentations are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of ACI or its committees. ACI web sessions are recorded at ACI conventions or other concrete industry events and will be made available for viewing free of charge for 1 week. Thereafter, they will be archived on the ACI website or added to ACI's online CEU program, depending on their content.
Our third presentation this morning is by Professor Jack Moehle at the University of California at Berkeley. Did I get that right, Jack?
It is the afternoon, though.
It is the afternoon, okay. But, it was interesting as Jim was talking about the data acquisition. I guess we are kind of stepping through the stages of progress in laboratory instrumentation. When I started working at PCA, working with Gene in 1973, we had upgraded to punch tape. So instead of the paper printouts, you got punched tape, and then after the testing was done, you'd run the punch tape over to the computer center. They put it in a reader. So then, instead of spending your time in the lab taking the data, individual strain gauge readings, you spent your time trying to find all the errors in the punch tape because they would inevitably feed wrong, and so that's progress. But Jack's going to talk to us this afternoon about some of Gene's work and work of others in the behavior and design of earthquake-resistant structural walls. So, Jack?
Thanks, Tony. It's interesting as we're talking about instrumentation, my career kind of spans a peculiar range where I started using dial gauges and this paper punch that you would collect. And then we were doing shaking table tests at Illinois, and we used analog tapes to record the data. And then through the digital era, and we've come full circle because now we are splattering paint on the surfaces of specimens and having thousands of data points through the paint, and we're taking pictures, and therein is the data. That then gets processed essentially through a finite element-like program to output strain fields in specimens. Anyway, Tony, thanks very much for the introduction. It really is an honor to be here, to be able to speak at this session, recognizing a few of the contributions of Gene Corley. I first met Gene in the early 1980s, and by then Gene had made many of the contributions we've already heard about, and in fact had done most of the work that I'm going to talk about today. And I knew about this work, the flat plate work and the hinge rotation work and some of the shear wall work. And I was amazed early in the 1980s to go to a ACI convention and meet this guy, Gene Corley. And not only meet him, but he took me out to dinner. I remember going out and talking with him at dinner, and he cared and was always friendly and good to the people he knew over the years. I worked with Gene in the seismic subcommittee of ACI 318, where his experience in research and in earthquake reconnaissance contributed tremendously to what the subcommittee was able to accomplish. Much of what's there in the seismic chapter today owes to Gene's contributions there. More recently, I've probably had more experiences with Gene in litigation. And always I seem to be on the opposite side of Gene. But I learned through the process that he was a savvy and skilled expert. He really was. And very creative in some of the things that he did, very convincing in the work he did. And even though we didn't always agree, I think we always didn't agree, we remained good friends. And at ACI meetings, we would chat over a glass of wine and have little jokes about the things that were happening in litigation. And we stayed friends. We stayed above what was going on behind the scenes. So it was really a great pleasure to know Gene, and we miss him. But today I want to talk about one aspect of Gene's work that was really influential for earthquake-resistant structures, the subject of structural walls. And by the way, we are going to stick with the term structural walls in this presentation. One of Gene's insistences was that they be called structural walls and not shear walls, because they are intended to respond not through large deformations in shear, but to respond as structural elements, maybe mainly in flexure. So Gene always insisted they be structural walls. Sharon Wood, who's in the audience, helped me put these slides together. In fact, Sharon came up with the first version of these slides, shared them with me, and then I've added to them to bring in some of the other topics that were under this general subject that Gene contributed to. To set the stage a little bit, go back to the 1960s to recall where we were in the 1960s with regard to seismic design. Jim, yours already showed this book. It was a very influential document, came out in 1961. And we often think back to this book when we think about the design of frames and the contributions that came through this book to earthquake-resistant frame design. But it's also interesting to look back at the book in terms of what was known about shear walls, or excuse me, structural walls at the time. Bear in mind, I live and work in California, and most engineers don't call them structural walls there, despite Gene's efforts. But at the time this book was written, the knowledge on shear walls, structural walls, was relatively limited. Here, a photograph of a test from the Moehle laboratory, in which a wall was configured really as a simply supported beam with a single point load acting roughly at the center. And one can see how the compression struts, in essence, are developing as the load is strutting down to the support points at the extreme corners of this wall. The PCA book had some suggested details for walls. The suggestions varied the number of curtains with the wall thickness, and had recommendations with regard to how big the bars ought to be as a function of how thick the wall was. But it was pretty rudimentary at the time. The book recognized the importance of walls, but design in those days was, as I say, rudimentary. Gene Corley, through work at the PCA, did a tremendous amount of development related to structural wall behavior. And I'd like to go through and point out some of what I consider to be the key papers in this field. And I read these when I was much younger, and I think, like the presenters before me today, reread these papers getting ready for today. And I've reread these papers many times, and every time I go back, I find very interesting and useful things related to the behavior of walls and coupling beams. These works are loaded with insight, and I encourage, if you haven't read these recently or ever, go back and take a look at these papers. And I'm going to spend just a moment on the work by Barda et al. In the upper left on low-rise walls. There's a test series by Barney, I want to point out, on coupling beams. And then there was a series of laboratory experiments on more slender walls. Tony, you were involved with many of these. You probably should be giving this talk. But very influential set of tests on slender structural walls that influence how we design buildings today. The first, just looking back at the low-rise wall tests reported by BARDA, these tests were conducted on low-rise walls, squat walls, with various aspect ratios, but typically 1-to-1 aspect ratio or lower, and explored what the fundamental force resistance mechanisms were in walls. And the graphics are, even by themselves, remarkable as I look at the way the data are conveyed on how this was configured and how it was tested. Beautiful graphics coming out at the time. The work had many conclusions. I just want to point out a couple that I think still ring very true today and that we need to always be aware of. In these experiments, one of the things that was looked at was how does horizontal reinforcement and vertical reinforcement, how do they affect the strength of a wall? And this work was able to demonstrate in the upper left figure that in a low-rise wall, the horizontal web reinforcement really isn't that important for resisting shear. You have to have the reinforcement, it was noted in the paper, to control cracks, to make sure that the wall behaved properly. It was good to have the reinforcement there. But in terms of strength, the strength was not much affected by the horizontal reinforcement. The vertical web reinforcement was where the key to the strength was, which was clear in the data, for example, shown in the middle figure, whereas the vertical reinforcement increases, the strength of the wall goes up almost linearly. And then the aspect ratio of the wall also has an effect on the strength. The lower the aspect ratio, the higher the native strength of the material. And one of the remarkable figures from this paper is, to me, the one on the left, in which, in this paper, there is a discussion about where the flexural compression zone ought to be, and it's shown off on the right. But through the instrumentation that was used in these experiments, the researchers were able to identify where was the compression really located. And it was quite obvious that the compression formed a strut diagonally across the element. And the presence of the strut, of course, tells us why the vertical reinforcement is so important. It's to provide equilibrium for these struts. Okay, it's the vertical steel mainly that keeps that strut in equilibrium as shear is applied. And the figure on the right again shows the effect of the horizontal reinforcement, the vertical reinforcement on the strength of these walls. So very basic insights on how low-rise walls behave in the BARDA paper. The Barney paper is a very interesting one to me for a few reasons. It looks at conventionally reinforced coupling beams and diagonally reinforced coupling beams. Now, Gene wasn't the first one to think of the diagonal reinforcement. I think Tom Pauley is, to my understanding, the one who originated the idea of using diagonal reinforcement in these coupling beams. What Gene was looking at here was exploring whether the diagonal reinforcement would be effective in beams that had larger aspect ratios. The tests in New Zealand were very deep elements, and these were more slender elements. And so Gene and his team were looking at more slender beams using diagonal reinforcement. And here's some photographs from the original work. We'll come back to the photograph because I find it particularly interesting. But through this work, Gene and his researchers were able to demonstrate that the diagonal reinforcement was very effective even for beams that were more slender. And shown on the right is a typical result for a diagonally reinforced beam compared with the behavior of an otherwise equivalent conventionally reinforced beam on the left. And so this demonstrated, for the purposes of the building code, what were the limits in terms of aspect ratio for use of these elements. In the last code cycle, there was interest to change the way we reinforced the diagonally reinforced beam. For reasons that are a bit of a mystery to me, the diagonal reinforcement has, in the United States codes, as we look at a diagonal, each diagonal gets an individual wrap. And that individual wrapping is very difficult to implement in the field. It's easy to leave something out. Even in research laboratories, we find where the greatest attention is applied to this reinforcement, it's sometimes left out. So the question that came up in the code committee was whether or not it would be acceptable to simply confine the entire beam cross-section. And we didn't really know, but I went back and looked at Gene's tests, and look what Gene did. He confined the entire cross-section. And so this told me, by going back to this earlier work, that it would work. And so we moved forward with the code change proposal, really based on knowledge that these tests had demonstrated that you could confine the entire cross-section of the beam. You didn't have to confine the individual diagonals. The specific details that we came up with in the code ended up being tested through a test series funded by Pankow Foundation at UCLA. And those tests were very important for demonstrating that the details that we came up with in the code worked well and produced an equivalent behavior. But importantly, Gene knew it would work right from the beginning because he'd done it that way, and it has sort of been lost over the years. Then came a series of really important laboratory tests on slender structural walls. And there's a series of several reports that came out, reports to the National Science Foundation mainly, but also some key papers that I pointed out previously. I want to reach into these test series and just pull out what I consider to be a few of the gems that come from this work. So just to get a sense of what was being looked at the time, this is the 1970s. So there were rectangular cross-section walls. There were the barbell wall, which was in some widespread use at that time, and flanged walls. And the barbell wall seems to have fallen out of favor in actual construction these days in the United States. We don't see many of those being constructed anymore. But these were the configurations looked at that time. And there were both tests on walls with more or less ordinary confinement and then special confinement, left versus right, for rectangular walls, the barbell-shaped wall, and the flanged wall. And a series of experiments were carried out on these different elements. One of the things that I find particularly interesting, looking back at the work, is something that is fully overlooked in all the computer software that we use today to analyze these wall buildings, up to 1,000 feet tall. And that's the interaction, the coupling that occurs between flexure and shear. And if we look at the left-hand side, the instrumentation was set up so that one could measure, separate out what was the flexure, the rotational deformations of flexure. And on the right-hand side, what were the deformations associated with shear? And what one finds is that when the wall yields in flexure, it yields in shear. Even though the wall is reinforced such that the shear strength is greater than the shear corresponding to flexural strength, this is controlled by flexural yielding. Even though it is, there's inelastic shear deformation that's occurring. And to this day, I don't think any of the software that's used widely by practicing engineers picks this up. It's sort of been lost. It's been rediscovered recently in some other ACI papers that have used some of these data and run new tests and have rediscovered this thing. But Gene knew about it and wrote about it back in those days, and we're still waiting for someone to implement this in software so that we can get a better measure of what the real behavior of these wall buildings is. This was laid out very clearly in these papers that there would be additional shearing deformations that develop, especially important in the lower stories, and those things should be considered in design of the rest of the building frame. But it's yielding in flexure, but it shows up in shear. The work also demonstrated how cyclic loading affected behavior and how aspect ratio or the shear demand affected the behavior. And shown here are results from 3 different tests. One of these is a monotonic test. This is wall B4. And under monotonic loading, of course, the deformation capacity is excellent. It's robust, displaced to a top displacement of 13 inches. I forget how tall. Tony, how tall were these specimens? But 13 inches is a lot. They must have been 20 feet or so tall. But 13 inches is a lot of displacement in a structural wall. And then the plot with it for wall B3 is the same wall but subjected to cyclic loading. And there's a reduction in resistance, not so significant, but there is a reduction. And the deformation capacity is reduced because of the fatigue damage that occurs associated with cycling. If essentially the same wall is subjected to higher shear stress, then the deformation capacity is even further reduced. And so one of the early observations there was the importance of shear on the effect on displacement capacity of the structural wall. And this has kind of been overlooked in the codes in many ways. There's a limit to what the shear stress can be in design, and most engineers design right up to that limit because they can, but without realizing that there's a price that is paid in terms of deformation capacity. So something still to be done maybe in the building codes related to Gene's contributions here. Another really interesting aspect, and I think a gem of work, and I think, Tony, you worked some on this and as well as others, was looking at the web crushing of slender walls. What's shown on the left is the crack pattern that develops in a structural wall early on in the test, before there's a lot of inelastic response. And that was not supposed to come up. But what we see is that the cracks, let's get this cursor over here, originally have a particular inclination. The struts, if you want to call them that, come down along the length of the wall, such that there's shear resistance provided somewhat uniformly along the length of the wall web. But as the inelastic response is increased, as yielding occurs, there's a crack opening that occurs along the base of the wall. There's a realignment of the, let's call them shear cracks, and a buildup or an accumulation of shear that occurs in the web near the flexural compression zone. And this buildup can lead to what's known as web crushing. And Gene had sent me this crisp photograph from his records probably about 2 years ago. I made a request, can I get a copy of that photograph from the paper that was written here, because the original doesn't copy so well. And Gene found it and sent it right away. But this shows the kind of web crushing that occurs in these walls. The web crushing was identified as being a function of the shear that the wall is carrying, as well as a function of the deformation demands. And as the wall has increasing deformation, the effective strength of this compression zone decreases. And what was recommended from the paper, one was a varying shear stress capacity as a function of deformation demands or as a function of concrete strength and other variables. But ultimately what comes out of this is the understanding that you shouldn't go above about 10 square roots of F prime C shear stress in PSI units. Today, unfortunately, every design that I see is right at 10 because it's allowed. And one has to worry, do those walls have the rotational capacity that we'd hope for? So we maybe in our codes can bring in some of the ideas that maybe Neil, you referred to earlier, that in punching shear even, the punching shear strength is a function of how far past the yield point one goes. Maybe there's a need to revisit some of these factors here as well. But fortunately through Gene's work, this was all tuned to work at about 1.5% drift ratio. It's probably quite safe for designs today. A little further to some of the work related to flexure versus shear response. In this slide, which Sharon had put together really, compares a flexural strength. Let's refer to that as V sub n F, F for flexure. And then there's a shear capacity or strength, V n sub V, V for shear. And the shear strength is defined by the familiar equation here. And the nominal capacity then is the minimum of the shear corresponding to flexural strength or the shear corresponding to shear strength. And if we look at all the results, we find that the methods for calculating strength are conservative. Not overly conservative, but just right. So the strengths that are measured in the lab vary from something like 1.05 to 1.45 times the strength that is calculated. And that's the good thing. It's interesting, though, to compare the strengths of these walls in terms of their flexural strength or moment strength versus their shear strength as calculated. So the horizontal axis is the nominal strength and in flexure, and the vertical is in shear. And the various walls are plotted along here. And any wall that would fall on this line we would anticipate has shear and moment strengths equal, and either failure could happen. What's actually observed is interesting. If the wall is made much stronger in shear than the flexural demand, then it actually fails as a blue circle in flexure. But any other wall that's not made quite so strong in shear yields in flexure first, and then it fails in shear. And so all the other points, the squares plotted up in the upper right, are really shear failures that occur after flexural yielding. And if we put the phi factor of 0.6 in, we get the results to line up kind of the way we'd like to see them lining up. But it's interesting to me that it was recognized that even though you use a capacity design concept, you still get a shear failure eventually if the deformations are large enough. And I think this is a universal truth, not just for slender walls, but for beams, for columns, and for slabs, it seems. So here, again, just looking at all the data, and I forget why this is looking at the drift ratios as a function of the shear capacity. And it seems about 4 roots F prime C is a good limit if you don't want to have a shear failure eventually. We design most buildings at about twice that shear. So we have to expect, if the earthquake occurs and the deformations are large enough, the eventual failure mode after initial yielding is probably going to be in shear. But it's not all bad news, because all these walls do have some deformation capacity that I think we can rely on before they get to the point where shear failure would be a concern. Gene's papers on these subjects have a variety of conclusions, and I'll just go through a few. All the specimens are capable of 1% drift capacity. And if you think about a wall fixed at a foundation, 1% in the first 1 or 2 stories is pretty darn good. Walls with confined boundary elements have larger deformation capacity. Walls with the web crushing have somewhat lower deformation capacities, as might be expected. And the maximum inelastic displacement depends on the loading history. Okay, the monotonic loading versus a multiple set of cycles. Average shear stress of about 4 roots F prime C is really the boundary between what the ultimate failure is going to be, whether it be in shear or in flexure. A little surprising compared with what's in the codes today. The VN it has to be at least 0.6 for flexure times 0.6 of what the shear value is to avoid shear failure. And walls with low web reinforcement ratios are susceptible to degradation in shear strength, as we've seen. So these are just some of the gems I found from looking at Gene's work, and Sharon as well, I think, agreed these are some of the key points in some of his work on low-rise walls and coupling beams and slender structural walls. Thank you.
Questions for Jack? Nita?
Other 3 questions. I will fire them at once. The first is you talked about struts. Were they prismatic struts or were they bottle-shaped struts? 2, you said there were a few reasons. What's your definition of few? I'd like to know. And,
I don't recall.
well, you use that.
I'll skip that question.
And 3, and that's a sincere question, didn't Slater and Ziplock use diagonal reinforcement in the year 1918? Do you remember that?
So let's answer the last one first. Yes. The second question, I don't recall having stated that, sir. And then
I have it recorded.
okay. But back to the first question about bottle-shaped struts. When was the last time you bought a bottle of water at a store?
Yesterday.
Yes. Sharon, do you have one? What's the shape of that? That's a bottle-shaped strut. It is a uniform cross-section, unlike the bottle-shaped strut that's in the code. So these were indeed bottle-shaped, as in being parallel to one another.
Now, how come they didn't obey the code?
I believe they did obey the code, but as we who've worked on the code know, the code is not something structures obey. It's a set of rules for designing structures to behave a way that we hope they do. And Gene's contributions to that way of thinking and to the actual mechanics in the code, I think, were great.
Other questions?
Yes, you mentioned that so far there isn't a reliable computer program or analytical approach to represent the interaction between flexure and shear. But there is a recent work of Professor which I validated the experimental result, and they use this sort of, let's call it, truss model, but a smart truss. So my question is, what do you think of this model?
Yeah, so the comment is that there have been some models developed recently using truss-like elements that you said they were smart truss elements. I think the smart is here when the engineer sets up the orientation of those elements.
There is a tensile strength.
Yes. Yes. And those types of models can accommodate this behavior that was observed in the tests, wherein the mechanics is quite simple. If you have a strut driving down the elements, you think of a segment of the wall as a prismatic bottle-shaped strut, that if the vertical steel yields, that strut rotates. And through that process, you see shear deformation coming out of the flexural or the yielding of the longitudinal steel. And those kinds of truss models are capable of seeing that. But I don't know that any of those have been widely used in today's software. Most of the software that is used for buildings that are designed to resist earthquake effects, the software that's used doesn't reflect this, and I don't know that there's any efforts being made to implement this change. But yeah, there's always somebody who's doing it. Yes.
So let me ask Jack, what is your opinion of what we do in the code and how it gets reflected in the software? For example, it seems to me that there's quite often a real disconnect between we put stuff in the code, but how does the software respond and who qualifies the software?
So that's a tough question to repeat, but I mean, we put things in the code, in the building code, but the things that show up maybe in the software don't really model what we know is happening in the code. I have to agree with you. It's often quite true. The explanation I usually hear is that the software is not an analysis tool that's intended to analyze and exactly represent what's going on in the building. It's a design tool. And as a design tool, if one can reasonably reflect the main parts of the inelastic response, the yielding of the longitudinal steel, and use those softwares to estimate what the shear and other demands are, that's enough. Doesn't have to be exactly right. I think one of the areas, though, where we fall down a little bit in terms of carrying the results of these kinds of experiments into the code and into practice is in understanding how the deformations really affect what the resistance is. And many of the tall buildings that are being designed today, they're in the very long period range. We think that the inelastic demands are pretty low. And so for those buildings, these shear strengths, these limits of 10 roots F prime C are fine. But in other kinds of buildings where the demands might be much higher, it's not 100% clear that these limits are always going to be the right limit. So I think bringing into the building code process, the design process, the linkage between what the force demands and capacities are with the displacements that are expected is the next step we need to be thinking about. And some of that's happening, but we haven't gone far enough.
Jack, you reported that in the tests of Jean on slender walls, he had observed flexural failures and subsequently reaching the shear failures. Is it surprising, given that he has done a lot of work in the area of inelastic deformations and redistribution of internal stresses and forces, that he would reach this conclusion? Because we know that once you reach the flexural capacity in those walls, the cracks are going to reorient themselves, and as long as the walls are not overly reinforced and cause the diagonals to crash, then you can reorient, be able to reach from one mode of failure to the other. Mm-hmm. Is that reasonable?
No, I think it is reasonable, and to me, one of the important things this points out is the limitation of capacity design. I mean, it's an appropriate tool, but it has a limitation if, in fact, the strengths move as a function of what the deformation demands are. And in the ACI building code for beams, as an example, we set the required shear strength based on the shear force that develops when the beams yield in bending. And then the reflection of the fact that the shear strength is moving is really done by setting V sub C equal to 0. And that just gives you an extra margin in your initial strength so that when some degradation in strength occurs, you still have enough capacity. But eventually, even in a beam, you'll exhaust the shear capacity if the deformations are big enough. I think it's an important part of capacity design that needs to be recognized better.
Thank you all for your participation, and thanks again to the speakers. A great job.